quickly due to the extremely hot conditions. Although providing a great advantage in terms of combat, the limited frontal area of the liquid-cooled Rolls-Royce Merlin engine affords very little cooling area. The only way in which the engine can be cooled effectively is for air to pass into the intake underneath the aircraft. For the air to be injected, there must be forward momentum. For there to be forward momentum, there must be flight. And for there to be flight, Mr. Mazza must take off pronto. This is what I know he will be doing in order to preserve this aircraft and to prevent its coolant from boiling over. Excess engine heating was a problem for airplanes like the Spitfire and the 109, particularly in desert climates, where both types of aircraft were operated during World War II and the North Africa campaign. The Supermarine Spitfire, designed by the great engineer R.J. Mitchell. Mitchell unfortunately did not live to see the culmination of all of his efforts to design this airplane, passing away prematurely from cancer. Although he was, of course, directly involved in the development of the earlier marine racers for Supermarine, and certainly in the development of the Spitfire itself. Again, he did not see the design from the position as a fully fledged combat aircraft. So taxiing out now from our ramp, this is Johnny Mazza. Who I'm sure, as I said, will waste no time in running through his preliminary flight check. As the plane taxis, you can also get an impression of the beautiful elliptical wing of the Spitfire. What a beautiful bird. And most probably the most beautiful, if not one of the most beautiful aircraft to come out of the Second World War. Machines built for war very rarely have an aesthetic appeal, but we can say without a doubt the fifth of that nation in 1948. Turning over now, a sound perhaps you've never heard in person. That is a genuine Daimler-Benz DB605 fuel-injected supercharged V12 liquid-cooled engine. What a sound. This is the sound you would have heard at aerodromes in France after the fall of France and the German invasion. This is the sound you would have heard in aerodromes on the Eastern Front during Operation Barbarossa, the 80th anniversary of which is actually this Monday, the 22nd of June. This is the sound that most people in the Luftwaffe would have heard from 1939 to 1945, serving in frontline units at aerodromes across Germany and other occupied territories in Europe. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, the most prolific fighter aircraft in history. More than 33,000 examples of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 were constructed during the Second World War, and today only a handful survive, and even fewer survive in airworthy condition. This particular aircraft represents a composite restoration of multiple airframes that were put together to create this. A representation of a genuine Messerschmitt Bf-109G. Again, powered by a DB605 engine. An aircraft that would have met its match in the form of the Supermarine Spitfire Mark IX, the North American P-51 Mustang. But here today, the Spitfire rides again with Mr. Mazza at the controls. Taxiing out, wasting no time in hot pursuit. The 109 can waste no time because It's all about survival, and that was the game. In the question of the Battle of Britain, it was going to determine whether or not Germany was going to invade the United Kingdom, and ultimately the success of the Royal Air Force, its tactics, and its technology would enable Britain to preserve its independence, to prevent a German invasion, and also to save the Royal Air Force for further actions yet to come, and to make the United Kingdom into the world's largest aircraft carrier, as the United States 8th Air Force and the Royal Air Force and its strategic bombing missions would ultimately bring the war all the way to Germany and prosecute that war at home islands during the Second World War. By a matter of luck, the British and their radar had evaded detection by Germany, or at least it was largely misunderstood by the Germans, who did have radar of their own. But they mistook the home chain radar system, which enabled the British to have Mazda in our Spitfire Mark 9. And I can hear the whine in the... Mike Spaulding prepares to take her into the skies and to engage in combat with our Spitfire. Since you probably haven't heard it before, we'll let you savor the sound of the of the Daimler-Benz engine. And again, don't forget to look for where the exhaust manifold is placed, as we'll come back to that later. Note too the narrowness of the undercarriage on the BF-109. And here we go. Cowling. Well, the reason is the DB605 engine is actually inverted. The cylinder head is at the bottom of the engine cowling, whereas on the Spitfire it's at the top. One of the primary reasons for this is that the Spitfire, in its original configuration, was carbureted. Can you imagine tuning carburetors on a 12-cylinder aero engine? Yeah, that's a tune-up I wouldn't want to pay for. But that was the way it was in 19 of the Messerschmitt, now passing overhead. The Messerschmitt BF-109's engine was inverted, and they could get away with that because planes like the Buffalo FW-190 didn't have this problem because their wings were built as a single piece, a single unit, which was attached to the airframe in a different manner, and therefore far more rugged in terms of its construction, never experiencing the same reservations or problems that Messerschmitt pilots experienced. Earlier versions of the Messerschmitt BF-109, they had the incredulity to ask the RAF, "So how are your experiments with radio direction finding?" To which they gave no answer. And we still have no answer to the question of the CO's query, but the panel now, Mr. Johnny Mazza in our Supermarine Spitfire. We think in our minds today the Spitfire was the savior of Britain. The Hawker Hurricane, the companion to the Spitfire, truly was the hero of the Battle of Britain, in large part because they were available in much greater numbers and were far simpler to manufacture. Please observe as Mr. Mazza backtaxis to his place at the ramp. The elegant lines of the Supermarine Spitfire belie a highly innovative structure. In fact, the plane is made of a stressed skin, and it looks as though he's actually backtaxiing to the fighter factory, so we may not be able to take a closer look, but you may have an opportunity later today. That being said, again, the skin of the Spitfire was stressed and also employed flush riveting, just like the BF-109 now flying overhead. greater alacrity and greater success than one might have imagined. The Messerschmitt VF-109 was used in great numbers in all theaters of operation in which German air services performed during the Second World War. And again, we're very happy to demonstrate for you this incredibly rare example of an airworthy 109G right here at the Military Aviation Museum. One of the challenges that confronted the Luftwaffe at the end of the war wasn't so much a supply of airplanes. In fact, some of the highest numbers of production were achieved by Germany in the middle of 1944, even as the war truly was turning against them. And they would continue to produce large numbers of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, as well as a few other aircraft types, including the Messerschmitt Me-262. Even as aircraft production began to fall off, the 109s continued to roll off the production line. Albert Speer, the Minister for Armaments in Germany at the time, along with William Messerschmitt, Gordon Tomp, the lead engineer at Focke-Wulf, as well as Ernst Heinkel, they all began to use decentralized manufacturing. By dispersing the manufacturing process, were able to increase their production numbers. However, in spite of the increase in production figures, what they really lacked and what they really wanted were pilots and fuel. The success of these strategic bombing campaigns by the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force of the United States Army Air Forces were so effective in destroying Germany's ability to produce oil, to refine oil, to produce fuel for use in aircraft of this type, was such that airplanes would be delivered to airfields or assembled at locations like Tempelhof Airfield in Berlin, a great airport which was not quite completed by war's end, but which was used extensively as an assembly plant for aircraft. Planes assembled would sit idle because there was no fuel to fly them. And in terms of pilots, the numbers of trained and qualified pilots in Germany, well, let's just say their ranks had practically been bled dry. Unlike most Allied countries who rotated their pilots from being on duty to being off duty, the German pilots remained in the hot seat essentially until they were either injured so badly that they could no longer fly, or until they were killed. Pilots losing limbs would frequently go back into flight with prosthetics, not uncommon. And many German pilots achieved scores well over 100 victories during the war, far in excess of their Allied counterparts. Coming in now, Mr. Mike Spaulding on final approach in our Messerschmitt Bf-109 Gustav. A round of applause, please, for Mr. Mike Spaulding, Chief Pilot of the fighter factory. We sure hope that he will, back vaccine, will be able to give it some. Please feel free to roll to Mr. Spaulding if you go some. Fire-breathing monster, and you can get a sense of why people were so truly terrified of the Messerschmitt. It was a fiendish weapon, it was a fascinating machine, and they now are in very, very short supply. So again, let's wait until Mr. Spaulding returns to the ramp and has shut off his engine before we give him a great round of applause, please. Mr. Mike Spaulding, everyone.
Down across here and got squirrely down there.